Hey everybody, today I'm going to teach you how to use a needle and thread to stitch up a hole in your pants or shirt or dress or whatever. This will come in handy in college when you need to just quickly fix up a hole in something that's worn out. So we'll start with our needle and thread. Notice that I am cutting the thread before I thread the needle. This makes sure that it goes through the eye of the needle easier. Once you get it through the eye of the needle, pull the thread while it's still attached to the spool so that you have a double line or double thread. We do this because it creates a stronger stitch. Notice that I don't cut my thread first. I pull it to the length that's desired, and then I'm going to cut it from the spool. So you'll notice the double thread. You should have that little loop at the end. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make sure my ends are even those out, and then I'm going to tie a knot by looping it around my finger. It's the easiest way to tie the knot there. And I'm going to make sure once I get that knot that I'm double knotted. So I'm going to do that 1 or 2 more times. The reason I'm doing that first is so that when I go to sew the stitch, it doesn't pull through the fabric. Some people actually sew the knot in so you don't have to tie it before. This is just my preference. I actually tie the knot here and then sew back through it when I start my stitch. Now that we have a nice strong knot, let's get started on our stitch. So luckily I have a hole right down the seam of this dress, which means that when I go to sew it up, it won't be as noticeable since it is along the seam. I'm going to start at the end of the tear, and I go through one side, so like the left-hand side, through the right. Now notice that my garment is inside out. I'm working on the inside of the garment, the inside of this dress. Then you just loop over the fabric, over that seam, go back through the left to the right. So the stitch is always moving left, through the left, into the right, over the seam, and then repeat. I'll give you a close-up in just a second. Because this is a patterned fabric, it's a little harder to see my stitch, but I'm going through the left-hand side of the fabric, through the right. The needle should be going through both at the same time. Pull it tight and then go over the stitch again so that you're going back through the left, through the right, loop over, and then go through the left and the right again. So we actually call this a whip stitch. There's a similar blanket stitch used in knitting, but this is the easiest and strongest stitch if you're just trying to do a quick fix for a tear. I'll fast forward through this process so that you can get a better idea of how to start and end the stitch. You can be an expert by the end of this video, but for now, enjoy the music. Now that I'm getting to the end of the tear, I'm finishing up the stitch by actually looping my needle back through my very last stitch to create a knot. So I'm looping my needle through the stitch. and then pulling the needle back through that stitch. You can do that as many times as you want until you feel like the knot is sturdy enough. You can also do this at the beginning of the stitch. I'm going to cut my needle from my stitch. If you would prefer to tie the knot at the end, you can. I would recommend using the stitch knot, but some people want to tie the ends. Personally, I would just cut them. Hooray! We have finished our stitch. Now we're going to turn it back over so we can see barely even noticeable. Notice that it's nice and smooth on the inside. This is another example of a shirt that I've sewn up where you could see the stitch on the inside is not as smooth as the stitch on the outside. That's why we work from inside out. And here's one more example of a small tear in a sweater where the knit or the weave of the sweater is a lot looser than the fabric we were previously working with. So we'll go through this process again, and I'll show you one more thing. And make sure when you're choosing thread that the thread matches the material color as closely as possible. It will make the seam look less noticeable. So again, we want to make sure we have double thread. We're going to tie that knot at the end of it, and make sure you have probably double the length of thread on your needle than whatever you're going to stitch up. We have plenty of thread on this one because my tear is very small in the sweater. So now notice that this hole is elongated, so I want to stitch it up so that the tear is using the least amount of fabric as possible here. I also want to have about the same amount of fabric on either side of the tear going through the needle. And in this case, I'm actually going to go back through that knot. I'm going to sew through the knot just to make sure this end of the stitch is pretty sturdy and that the knot doesn't go through the material, because again, the knit or the weave on this sweater is a little bit looser. So sometimes the knot may slip through, and that's when you may want to sew your knot into your material. So now that we're at the end of the tear, we've used our whip stitch to go through it. We're actually gonna stitch back over the first stitch. So I'm gonna work my way backwards now. This just ensures that the stitch is stronger. You don't have to do this. Sometimes depending on the material, you may want to do it just to make sure it's very secure. When you get to the end of your stitch, again, I'm going to go under that last stitch with my needle. Notice that it forms a loop. I will take my needle back through that loop to secure a knot. And I might actually do this twice just to make sure that that knot is secure. So I'll go back through it with my needle, go through the loop, and secure the knot. And at that point, you can just cut your thread and check out your handiwork. So again, this is something that is a quick fix. Hopefully you guys find it useful. You can use it now. It'll be handy when you go to college. And thanks for watching. Beautiful.